Chapter 13. Thorn Apple. Their conspiracy began in earnest the very next day. Gregor took pains to be punctual for his rounds with the novices and his appointments with advisors, especially Felix, in an effort to keep up appearances. But in their spare moments, he and Haille met in the north wing to exchange knowledge. Haille was of the same age as most of the students at Dalhstrom, but he lacked the guile, ambition, and the edge of cruelty that the Sorcerer cultivated in their selection process. It allowed Gregor to enjoy teaching his craft in a way he had not in many years. Haille understood the basics quickly, but with little time to practice, his progress was slow. Gregor began to bring him to sessions with the novices so he could witness further instruction, even if he could not practice. In the afternoon, roles reversed. Gregor and Haille trained with unsharpened swords that Haille had stolen from the armory. Their sessions ended with Gregor panting, his arms aching and his legs trembling, for it was a sort of physical fatigue he had experienced rarely before. Now he welcomed it. Such a contrast it was to the exertions of the mind. Haille's training ran deep, his natural talent even deeper, although he would often bend at the waist, hands on his knees, and lament the decline of his own conditioning and strength. "It has been so long since I practiced," Haille would say. Yet the parries, attacks, down strikes, side strikes, up thrusts, and the flourishes that accompanied them seemed to come so easily to Haille. He executed moves with the grace of a dancer and the certainty of a master instructor. Gregor noticed Haille's disposition brightening, especially in those instances when Gregor was able to exchange a prolonged series of strikes and blocks without faltering. "Well met, apprentice," Haille said after one such exchange of volleys. The phrase struck Gregor, and he laughed. "What is it?" Haille asked, moving to the corner where they had a barrel of rainwater to drink from. He dunked the ladle and lifted it, dripping, to his mouth. "My master says the same thing to me when I have impressed him with a spell or a conjuring." "Funny," Haille said, his mouth puckering as if the water's taste disagreed with him. "So did my sword instructor." "Perhaps mentors are not so different around the world. Haille?" Haille had doubled over, clutching his hand to his throat. He gagged and let out a ragged moan. As he coughed, blood spluttered on his lips. He touched his hand to his mouth, and at the sight of scarlet on his fingers and palms, his eyes grew wide. He dropped to a knee, his face pale, his eyes darting back to the barrel. Poisoned. They had let their guards down. Gregor had been so taken with having a co-conspirator, even a friend, he had forgotten to nurture a healthy distrust. The rain barrel, isolated in the north tower they had assumed was safe, but clearly his enemies had infiltrated even this haven. Haille was his senior and taller, so it took great effort for Gregor to move him, but with Haille's arm across his own shoulder, Gregor carried him to his chamber and let him collapse in his own bed. Gregor brought the chamber pot over, rifled through his own stocks of herbs, roots, and other medicinal plants and fungi. The room rang with the clack of his pestle and his mortar as he mixed an emetic. "We have to get you to vomit what you drank." Haille nodded, coughing into the pot, his hands clutching the rim, the tendons of his neck cording. "Then I'll need to determine what was in the water. It was meant for me, I'm sure." "Both of us," Haille said between hacks. The process of cleaning out Haille's stomach was a painful one that left him trembling as if with a fever. If it was exhaustion or an effect of the poison, Gregor was not sure, but when Haille's fingertips turned a shade of purple and his lips blue, while his eyes became bloodshot and tinged with yellow, Gregor knew. "Are you thirsty?" "Yes," Haille said. "Thorn apple. I know the signs." Gregor's master had taught him how to make the very same poison. It was useful for assassinations, especially because there was no known antidote, at least not medicinal. Gregor raced back to his study, scanned his bookshelves for a seldom-used volume of healing spells. "You always wanted me to be a killer, not a healer," he said as if to his master, taking notice for the first time how the dozens of volumes of spells inflicting pain, wounds, and death outnumbered those of healing. Gregor sighed and picked one of the 3 books of spells for convalescence. Let this be the right one. He worked late into the night, weaving a tapestry of enchantments around Haille, and mixing herbal brews for himself to keep sleep at bay. Gregor realized, with a tightening in his heart, that Haille had become his first real friend. He called on his gifts and pressed himself to unexplored limits in order to influence the battle raging within Haille's twitching, feverish body. The sun had long set, and the candles guttered, but the room was bright with the aura of spells of health and healing that Gregor replenished over Haille's prone shape throughout the night. Still, despite his concoctions, Gregor's mind became addled with sleep in the small hours of the night as he tried to decipher unfamiliar spells and ancient writing. The stars faded, and the waves on the rocks of the isle grew quiet with low tide. Eventually the runes with their flourished serifs blurred before his eyes, and Gregor nodded into sleep. His dreams were a recreation of the very reality he had just endured. In his imagination, Haille still struggled, gasping from the bed, Gregor unable to alleviate his pain. The other men whom they had sent to the seawall gathered at his bedside, the wounds on their backs weeping blood and pus, their hands and feet split with blisters, their faces pale and ghostly, like men who had drowned at sea. They regarded Gregor with pleading eyes. There were so many of them. Behind them waited other men, slaves from earlier seasons, men who had perished from exhaustion, disease, or starvation. Their faces were dry and stretched, and in some places, rot had opened gaping holes in their flesh. Stalking among them was the cat who had died, that had first signaled to Gregor his danger, but the cat turned, twisted up on 2 legs, and all at once, its fur grew dark and long into a cloak. Its eyes shaded to slits of blue, and from a mouth of saber teeth he heard his master speak. Gregor. But Gregor was not his true name. He changed his shape, as an archmage might, and he flew in the form of a seahawk over the exposed sandbars, along the leeward side of the island, leaving Dalhstrom behind, a dimple on the surface of the sea. He bent his wings to the rhythm of the winds, soaring above the atolls and archipelagos. Not the razor crags of his prison, but the sun-bathed, terraced hillsides with homes built of mud and wattle and thatch. Homes where families sat around tables and broke crab legs open to eat the steaming meat together, where fishing nets hung on the walls to dry and fires burned in the hearths. This was a place for neighbors and friends, leisure and laughter, not a place of study or ambition, deceit or subterfuge. The sun slanted in through windows, but the lamps were lighted anyway, giving off light, so much light that Gregor could see faces that he recognized. Mother, father. Nathan. My name is Nathan. The sea pressed close, just down the hill from their home, with its smooth walls and swinging shutters, thatch eaves rustling in the wind. The sea was ever present, pressing here too in this steel-gray outpost of guano-stained basalt, where winter clouds scudded, where the blood of slaves stained the rocks, and the morning bell tolled like a dirge. Gregor snapped awake. The room was gray with the weak light of dawn. The morning bell was indeed tolling on the far end of Castle Dalhstrom. He was lucky. The wind was just right that morning, gusting just enough to carry the ringing and not to overwhelm it. He would be expected at the morning assembly. At least he would be by those who had not conspired to poison him. An opportunity occurred to him in which he might unmask his adversaries simply by noting the surprise on their faces when he did show that morning. But first he turned to Haille. His friend was breathing the deep, slow breaths of sleep. Some color had returned to his face, but the skin beneath his nails was still an unhealthy shade of violet. Gregor was loath to leave him alone in the north wing, knowing that this once inviolate space of his was now compromised. But he knew the importance of keeping to schedule, lest his advisors come looking for him. He changed quickly, his clothes stale from the night before. He rubbed the sleep from his eyes, locked his chamber door behind him, then ran the length of the corridor to the assembly room. He let out a sigh of relief as he slipped in through the side door, smoothing down his doublet, and saw that the room was empty. His advisors, including Felix, were still outside the main doors, which parted and opened just as he sat down in his oversized throne. It was a large crowd that filed in, Gregor noting Felix last, studying his face more than the others for any sign of surprise. It was difficult, for there were strangers present, traders it appeared, seeking an audience. A glance at the southern window of the hall revealed to him a ship's mast that had not been there the day before. Felix was conversing with a tall man with a blonde beard and mustache who wore a long sword and an extravagant leather greatcoat. Gregor was not sure if he imagined it or not, but Felix's eyebrows arched with the slightest hint of surprise. It was fleeting, however, and his chief advisor easily fell into the routine of ceremony. "O great twice-born Lord Lacknor, he who hath conquered death to lead our order. Our shores are graced with the presence of merchants this morning, who offer to do business that might add to our ranks of labor." Gregor did his best to hide behind a mask of inscrutability, studying the flesh trader and the two specimens he pulled forth on a chain. Both slaves held their heads stiffly, with the forced posture of the iron thrall collars around their necks. One was a man with lank hair down to his collar, a scar on his jaw, and the tip of a tattoo showing just below his neck. Next to him, a woman was chained, her hair in tight braids, her skin the comely color of tea with cream. Gregor had heard of dark-skinned people from southern climes, but never had he seen one with his own eyes, or anticipated such beauty. "The man looks to be from good stock, but what do I want with a woman? The kitchens are staffed." "Perhaps as a personal servant," Felix suggested, "to replace your manservant, who seems to be missing." By the look of her stature, her toned muscles, and the hardened expression on her face, Gregor imagined he would end up dead by her hand before the sun rose the next morning. "Perhaps that is just what you want, Felix." "My manservant does not need replacing. He is busy with other duties this morning." Felix's face showed no emotion. "I'm sure she can be of some sort of service," the flesh trader said. His was a broad northern accent. Gregor feigned contempt and turned to Felix. "Who is this stranger who addresses me without introduction or title?" "Apologies," the flesh trader said, casting his bright blue eyes to the floor as he took a knee. He yanked on the chain so that the two slaves did the same. "My name is Twenge, Victor Twenge." Chapter 14. Unraveling. The prices for the slaves were more than reasonable. Twenge intimated that they could be a fractious lot, but Felix urged Gregor to approve the deal, reminding him that the castle could use more servants, and they certainly had the power to put down any further uprisings. The cooks prepared a noon banquet to close the deal. Twenge and his first mate, a man a size too small for his own greatcoat, accompanied him to the table but said nothing. The first mate's face was too kind for a slaver, and he spent most of his meal picking at his food and running his hand through his hair, allowing Twenge to carry forward the conversation. The flesh trader told stories of turning tribes against one another so that they would sell their enemies for weapons, even trinkets. Felix leaned close, taken with the business, or perhaps it was just his sycophantic nature. Gregor was unsure how to read his chief advisor any longer. And the business turns a healthy profit? Felix asked as Twenge took a drink from his goblet. It can, Twenge said, setting down his drink and twisting a chicken leg free from its carcass. But it takes a fast ship, a firm hand, and a bit of luck to outsmart the High Council's enforcers. We have our own ways of dealing with them, Felix said, tipping his own goblet to his lips. Felix was right, of course. The servor could be formidable merchants in such a dark trade. Something about the notion roiled the contents of Gregor's stomach, just as a novice served him a roast of lamb. Maybe I could return at some point, and we could discuss further arrangements, Twenge said, covering his goblet with his hand to defer more wine offered from another young novice. Gregor noticed his own advisors were not exercising the same restraint. Their faces were flushed, and their voices grew loud. He imagined they would be canceling their classes that afternoon. That could be mutually beneficial to all parties involved, Felix said, raising his goblet in a toast. Gregor stared down at his food. He had barely touched it, and he only drank from the pitcher of water on the table, the same pitcher available to everyone seated. He pushed back from the table. If you will excuse me, I must prepare for my rounds with the novices. Of course, Twenge said, standing and offering a shallow bow. Gregor's advisors were too drunk to notice he was leaving, but Felix did, nodding at him over his blood-red wine. Shall I send a novice to attend to you in your chambers? He asked, in case your manservant is still occupied. Gregor paused. The north wing remains my sanctuary. I prefer it that way. Of course. I just thought if he is so busy, you might need another. One is sufficient, Gregor said, his pulse beating in his temples. He swept up his doublet from the back of his chair, using the time to don the coat as an opportunity to think of a further response. He is quite indispensable. Felix let out a peal of laughter. I'm sure our friend Victor Twenge here would disagree. After all, every slave is expendable, are they not? Absolutely, Twenge said, his voice ringing out over the din of the drunk advisors. Gregor gave his own shallow bow. Good day, then. He walked at a brisk pace back to the north wing, running down the last corridor to his chamber door. When he had opened it, he found Haille pale, but sitting up, wrapped in a blanket. Gregor offered him a heel of bread he had swiped from the banquet table. Haille ate it slowly, then asked, I don't suppose you have any water? Gregor shook his head, searching the chamber for a container that might not have been compromised, but came up with nothing. It was too late. Haille began to retch and vomited up the bread, soggy with bile, into the chamber pot. Sorry, Gregor said. I'll try to find something when I make my rounds this afternoon. I'll take a flask from a novice or something. Haille winced and leaned back into the bed. The fact that I'm still alive feels like some sort of progress. It is. I think the worst is past. Wish I knew which spell it was that worked. I really just tried everything in the books. It would be good to know the enchantment to cure apple thorn poisoning. Haille grinned before his laugh turned into a cough. Gregor kept to his scheduled activities, supervising the novices in their studies and trials that afternoon. He saw things he had never noted before: the competitive nature of the students, their petty rivalries, the contempt they bore for each other, outdone only by their contempt for outsiders, outdone once more by their eagerness to impress Gregor. These were the breeds that the servor attracted and nurtured, a nest of vipers, full of deceit, bereft of friendship. And what will they do to me when they realize I am an impostor? They needed to escape, but how still eluded him. With the other advisors and instructors sleeping off their wine from the banquet, Gregor dismissed his own students early and returned to his chambers. Haille was sleeping again. Gregor settled into his reading chair, realizing just how weary he felt as well. He woke after moonrise. A frigid wind was blowing in from the open window, and when he went to close the shutters, he could see the ghostly outline of the breakers roaring on the rocks below. The sea was restless. Lightning veined the clouds on the horizon, and stray drops of rain struck the window-sill like pebbles. The hair on the back of Gregor's neck stood on end, and his temples tingled in a familiar way. He was not alone. He turned. The room was dark, except for the pulsing of lightning. Illuminated in the brief flashes, he could see the outline of a tall, cloaked figure standing over the bed, where Haille shook and murmured in a fever dream. The cloak rustled. The dried flesh creaked, dust scattering on the floor, and the narrow blue eyes turned on Gregor. In the darkness, he could even see the cold orb of the moonstone set in the collar around the revenant's neck. Its light trembled with rage. "Master, you have returned," Gregor said, dropping to his knee. "What is this?" The voice hissed like the wind tapping at the shutters, like a spray of foam smashed on the rocks below from the rising waves. "This is my manservant, poisoned by—" "Kill him." Gregor's voice caught in his throat. He moved his mouth, but no sound came. His ears rang in the wordless pause that lengthened between them. Finally, he managed a weak, "Why, my master?" "You dare question my imperatives?" "Only because he is my only ally in the castle, in the whole of the island. Sire, the enterprise unravels. Felix knows I am a fraud. He knows the order has been fooled." The figure of death stepped towards him, the corpse breathing out an odor of rot. "I have given you the tools to protect yourself. How many novices are loyal to you?" "I have no way of knowing." "Then what have you been doing?" the voice asked, the edge sharp. "Making a friend, something you never gave me. Practicing my craft, sire." "You are lying. What are you hiding from me?" The revenant stepped even closer and took the edge of Gregor's doublet in his fist. The scent of putrefaction was overwhelming. Gregor thought he would gag, but before his master could ask anything further, they both turned at the sound of feet approaching the door. No sooner did the bell in the courtyard begin to peal. The door shook with pounding, and Felix's voice came from the other side. "My lord, forgive my intrusion, but a dire situation arises." The revenant dropped him. Gregor scrambled in the darkness, taking in gulps of fresher air as he moved to the door, turned the lock, and swung it open. Felix waited on the far side, a lantern swinging from his hand, his face glistening with a sheen of sweat, his eyes wide and peering into the darkness over Gregor's shoulder, where he beheld the eyes of the revenant. He turned back to Gregor. "My lord, it is another revolt. The slaves, the new ones and the old ones, they have somehow escaped from their cells." Gregor, even if moments before he had been groveling, composed himself back into his role of commander and lord. He straightened his collar, snapped his fingers, and at once the candles in the room took light. The wide shoulders, long limbs, and the taut face of death were even more horrifying in the light than the darkness. The corpse moved its arm and replaced its hood, then waited for Gregor's command. "See to the rabble," Gregor said with as dismissive an air as he could muster. The revenant, playing the role of servant once again, stepped forward. Gregor could sense his hesitancy. Had his master not told him that Gregor himself was to handle the next uprising, lest he lose face with the servor? But now he had caught even his master in a bind, for he could not pretend to be disobedient before Felix. The revenant swept across the room and into the hallway, snapping at his cloak as he passed by Felix. Haille was sitting up, blinking, taking in the scene with a confused look on his face. He still leaned heavily to the side, one hand sinking into the mattress for support. The wind was blowing through another open window and drawing the curtains outside, so Gregor moved to snap the frame shut. When he turned, he saw Felix closing the door on the receding shape of the revenant. The advisor placed his palm flat on the door as it clicked into place, and then he turned the key in the lock, removed it, and dropped it in the pocket of his jacket. "We are alone at last." Gregor took in the room, the furniture, desk, reading chair, wardrobe, bedside table, chamber pot, a rack of firewood, and a fire poker, reading out his avenues of movement, escape, and attack. It was his own room, his most private sanctum, but something had shifted. He felt like a fighter in an arena. He could only hope Haille also sensed their danger. "Felix," Gregor said, adding as much steel to his voice as possible, "I shall send you to supervise the novices until the insurrection is put down." He had dropped his voice into his lowest register, so perhaps the tone of authority would overcome the tension he felt in his shoulders, the fluttering in his stomach, and the tremor in his hands. When Felix did not leave or respond, but instead crossed his arms and set his feet shoulder-width apart, Gregor did his best to muster impatience. "What are you waiting for?" "How long will you continue this charade?" Felix said, his voice flat and nasal, his lip curling. Haille slipped off the bed, sliding into his boots. Gregor moved away from him, remembering what Haille had taught him of physical combat and outflanking an opponent. Gregor knew he had to place himself and Haille in the periphery of Felix's vision, force him to divide his attention. "What charade is that?" Gregor asked, stalling. "You should have been able to cure this manservant quickly, a man of your power, your experience, your age. A slight poisoning should be nothing to a man who has conquered death to be reincarnated." "I said I wished for you to supervise the novices, Felix. Why have you not complied?" "Make me." The enterprise unravels. Gregor's gaze fell on the locked door. In his mind's eye, he pictured the revenant growing more and more distant. He was not without his own resources, he reminded himself, flexing his fingers, his knuckles cracking. He pushed his sleeves up his forearms. "What is your game, Felix?" "The game is all yours, boy. I knew Gregor Lacknor. I served him, and you are not he." "Careful how you speak to me." Felix barked out a laugh. "When will you quit, boy? You are an imposter. The Servor need a real ruler." Gregor had heard enough. He flung out his arm and cast a spell to incapacitate Felix, light arcing from his fingers across the room, his hand hot with the flow of power. But the bolt stopped short of Felix, as if hitting a shell of glass. "You think I have not prepared my defenses against you? The true Gregor Lacknor would be able to penetrate these shield walls with ease." Gregor sent a second bolt surging across the room, but it too fizzled short of his target. Felix struck back, splitting the air with a charge of his own, a razor of yellow light that Gregor deflected only at the last moment, the force of it sending him stumbling backwards, while rays of energy ricocheted and set the drapes on fire. Haille gasped in pain, his own boundaries barely established. Gregor realized the flashes of power would be excruciating to someone so uninitiated. Gregor reached out with his own aura to enclose Haille as well, but it diminished the potency of his own attacks. Felix knew it. He waved his hand, trapping the chandelier in a withering spell of heat. The air shimmered and reduced the twisting iron limbs to molten metal that he sent in a sizzling rain at them both. Gregor countered with a gust of wind that threw most of the furniture and odds and ends into a pile against the hearth. The fire dimmed, then brightened as it spread to the debris and sucked at the gust of air in the room. Gregor sent more bolts at Felix, powerful spells of pain and maiming, Comets of fire, spinning discs to rent his flesh, all enchantments taught to him by his master. But Felix's defenses were powerful and elaborate. He was more a mage than Gregor had realized. They circled one another, animals in a cage vying for an advantageous angle, but neither found one. The room was becoming smoky as the fire spread among the furniture. Clouds of dust rose from bricks shattered by explosive spells. Gregor was aware of the bell clanging on the far side of the castle, the crashing of waves outside, and the shaking of the shutters in the wind. Felix lunged, leading with a bright flurry of incantations, tangled with the shield walls that protected him. It took everything in Gregor just to hold the attack at bay. Felix stumbled, his foot caught on a curl in the rug, swept out of place by the swirl of elements. Sensing an opportunity, Haille grabbed the end of the rug closest to him and yanked it. Felix lost his footing and tottered over. Gregor fired such a gale of wind that his advisor smashed against the wall. But Felix was quick and skilled. He countered with a spell to knock himself out of the blast and flattened him against the floor. Then, with preternatural strength, he pushed upwards, leapt the length of the room, and landed on Gregor, his hands on his neck. They tumbled close to the spreading fire, Gregor redirecting his energies to protect himself from the scalding heat, while Felix focused his own mind on growing the flames. The light danced in his eyes and on his face, his teeth showing in a smile of satisfaction. Gregor's vision clouded with spots. This was the physical violence that he was so inexperienced in. But some of Haille's training came back to him. His magical powers at a stalemate, he turned to the hearth, caught sight of the fire poker growing red-hot in the flames, and summoned it to his hand. It burned the skin of his palm, but he swung it nonetheless and connected with Felix's temple. It was no mighty strike, but Felix had been prepared for a magical attack, not a physical one. He let go of Gregor's neck to block the next blow. Sweet air returned to Gregor's lungs, blood to his brain, and he aimed the poker at Felix's eyes. He missed, catching Felix instead in the neck, sending him back, gagging. Haille was waiting, with the chamber pot raised high. He brought it down on Felix's head, the sides shattering, exploding outward with a spray of waste. Felix was not finished. He countered with a burst of power that flung both Gregor and Haille against the walls, blew out the shutters, smothered the fire, and reduced the locked door to splinters. Gregor struggled on all fours to recover. Haille rolled to his side, blood dripping from a gash on his forehead. His clothes were soiled with the contents of the chamber pot. Felix was not much better. He staggered to his feet, his body glistening with waste, his powers for the moment spent. He picked up the fire poker and stepped towards them, raising it over his head. "I'll beat you to death," he said through bared teeth. But the beating did not come. Instead, a figure flew in through the open doorway, a blur of graceful movements. A sword flashed and knocked the poker out of Felix's hand, sending it clattering across the floor. Victor Twenge, the flesh trader, stood between Gregor and Felix. Felix as surprised to see him as Gregor was. Felix recovered from the shock, took in his new adversary, gathered what power he had left, and moved to send a spell onto Victor. But a second figure stole into the room, slipping behind him, and with a whoosh and a clunk, struck Felix in the head with a spinning wooden staff. The woman Gregor had seen before, the one presented as a slave, stood with her legs apart, one arm out for balance, the other still spinning the staff until it came to rest behind her back. It made a small, delicate tapping noise as she set its end on the floor. Haille was sitting up, wiping the blood from his forehead. "Chloe, you are a sight for sore eyes." The woman smiled, nudging Felix with her toe to make certain he was out cold. "I might say the same, Prince Haille." "Prince?" Gregor asked, but before Haille could answer, The flesh trader, or at least the man pretending to be one, interrupted. "Time for life stories later. We need to get to the ship." Chapter 15. A Time for Steel. Gregor led Twenge, Haille, and the warrioress named Chloe up a set of stairs and into the castle battlements. The air was swirling with raindrops as the nearing storm was ready to break, but this was the route on which Gregor thought they would be least likely to encounter the Revenant. It also allowed Gregor to survey the growing chaos in the castle courtyard and outside along the quay. Haille's rescuers had set free all the slaves, and they were destroying everything in their path to the Respar, the waiting ship. The library was aflame. Scaffolding holding up the crumbling seawall lay toppled. Tapestries, furniture, and paintings burned in piles throughout the courtyards and along the walkways. The youngest novices had retreated to their dormitory, bunched in the upper windows where they watched the chaos unfold. Formerly loyal guards were in flight, overwhelmed by the number of slaves barging up from the dungeons. A few Servar fighters were making a stand along the quay, aided by 6 older novices, eager to test their powers on living men, but even they were falling back from the onslaught. They had taken cover in a stone archway that stood between the quayside and the inner courtyard. It was a bottleneck of sorts, and they had managed to block the way for the vanguard of attacking slaves. The man who had been bound with Chloe stood at the fore of the escapees, a staff like her own in his hands. But even with numbers on his side, he was not able to lead the slaves past the novices and guards in the archway. Everything was coming apart. Gregor's role, his identity, his loyalties. Gregor knew the 6 novices. They were advanced students, and each particularly cruel and ambitious. He noted the glee on their faces when their spells struck home and snuffed out the life of another bedraggled slave. They were discovering the true extent of their power and were growing drunk on it. With a shatter spell, one brought down a wall of the castle on a dozen or so slaves. Another set fire to 2 who had been lucky enough to dodge the falling stones. A third novice mixed the attack and sent a shatter spell into a group of men. They vaporized into a sickening cloud of red. "I have to stop this." Haille rested his hand on Gregor's shoulder. Time to choose sides. Gregor breathed deep. Before he could even let it out, Chloe had grabbed Gregor's collar. "Can you stop them?" "I can, if we get closer." They were on the battlement, a bow shot from the fighting below. A stairway led downward into the castle floors, but Gregor was afraid of what enemies or allies they might meet in the maze of hallways on the way. "There's no helping it," he said aloud, but mainly to himself. "Follow me." They ran down the steps, coming across a few huddled novices immediately. Gregor ordered them to flee to the north wing for safety. What use did he have for his private sanctuary any longer? 2 floors further down, they crossed a hallway by the entrance to the treasury, where 4 guards assigned to protect Dalhstrom were carrying out bags of treasure on their shoulders. Upon seeing Gregor, they froze, realized they had been caught, and drew their swords to fight their way free. Gregor raised his hands, the power tingling in his fingertips. But before he could speak, Chloe and Twenge danced into their midst, sword cutting, staff swinging, and the men were fallen, dazed, dumb, or dead, their bags of gold spilling out, a coin rolling to stop between Gregor's legs, the face of his namesake, Gregor Lacknor, looking up at him. "Let's go," Chloe said, nodding for him to continue leading them. A few more stairwells and a few more soldiers dispatched, thanks to Chloe and Twenge, and they were at the level of the quay. To their left, the wood planks of the docks rested between pylons, leading to the waiting ship. To their right, the novices were making their stand in the archway. Chloe caught Gregor looking at the Respar. "Not yet. We're not leaving without our men." "And the poor bastards they had chained up here too," Twenge said. "Understood," Gregor said. He signaled to them to wait, while he stole up behind the novices and guards. With a quick spell of sleep, he dropped all but 3 of them who were out of reach. They were the same 3 novices he had seen taking such joy in killing the slaves earlier. Their faces were masks of glee as they blew apart walls of the castle, as well as men. But their aim was poor, and their judgment worse. One sent a ball of flame arching through the air, only to land on the dock itself, setting it on fire. Gregor recognized that they were spaced too close to one another, and he saw an opportunity in the form of a rowboat rocking in the harbor. He focused his thoughts on the knots and lines mooring it until the ropes went slack. Then he flung the boat into the archway, where it slammed into the 3 novices and knocked them clear into the harbor. They were quickly more occupied with reaching the shore and not drowning than killing. "Come on!" Gregor waved to the slaves. They needed little encouragement and came running or limping under the burden of their injured brethren. The man with the staff neared him, carrying a boy just a few years younger than Gregor. So young. What has been done in my name here? Another group of slaves, these moving slower than all the others, their limbs emaciated by starvation, passed through the archway. When one stumbled, Gregor ran to his side and propped him up. His body was hard, the bones poking through his withered flesh. He smelled horrible, but Gregor wrapped his arm around him nonetheless, and together they worked their way down the dock toward the waiting ship. The sailors were dropping the sails and preparing for a quick escape. Slaves who knew how to sail were helping to haul lines aboard. Chloe took the young boy from the arms of the man she had been chained to and called to him, "Get those men to hurry up, Val." By those men, she meant the ones Gregor was with. The man Chloe called Val ran into their midst, followed by Victor and Haille, who between the 2 of them lifted up and carried aboard the man Gregor was helping. Unburdened, Gregor turned back to look at the castle. The flames had spread within, so that the windows glowed like angry eyes. Curds of smoke rose into a column that slanted on the storm wind. Lightning continued to pulse, flashing white trees connecting sea and clouds on the horizon. Guards were in full retreat, novices scattered, his own advisors in hiding. All Gregor knew, all his life, was in ruin, and a new life waited, just a few steps up the gangway. A life with friends, without false identities, deception, and lies, with camaraderie, not competition nor conspiracy. He didn't know what he was waiting for. He turned, ready to climb aboard and sail into a new beginning. Then he felt a presence. It was as familiar as it was dreadful. His master's power, unmasked and bearing down on the lot of them on this tiny corner of this tiny island. The flames had risen like a wall between the castle and the quay, but walking through, unscathed, unflinching, was the Revenant, a figure of death, hellfire surrounding him. The last of the men were still scrambling for the gangway. Val was the first to turn, his staff in hand. Chloe followed him back down off the ship, Victor twenged behind her. They made a wall, parting for the slaves who cowered at the sight of the figure in the inferno. The wind ruffled their clothes and pulled at Chloe's braids. The Revenant passed beyond the flames, his body smoking, his eyes terrible slits of blue, the stone at his neck a third eye of pure ice. He shed his cloak, revealing the formidable body of a warrior not dead and not alive, the figure who had been Gregor's protector. For so long, Gregor had taken comfort in the sight of this figure, but now he saw him as so many others must have, an executioner. Gregor's chest felt hollowed out by fear, his blood pumping in his limbs, his fingertips shaking. "This is how you repay me," he heard his master's thoughts in his mind. Gregor had no rebuttal, but Val did, readying his staff. Chloe didn't. She turned, tossed hers to Gregor, then drew the sword from the scabbard at her waist. "Val, this is the time for steel," she said. Twenge, his own long sword already drawn, looked across at the man called Val, who nodded, tossed his battle staff to Gregor, and drew his own gleaming sword. Haille's feet pounded down the gangway, and he came to Gregor's side. "Come on, get on the ship." "No," Gregor said, handing the battle staffs to Haille. "They will need me. Go." Haille, Prince Haille, whoever he was, nodded and stepped back onto the ship along with the last of the slaves, while Val, Chloe, and Twenge spread out along the dock. "An unlikely alliance as I could have ever imagined," Twenge said. "Strange times," Val said out of the corner of his mouth, his teeth grinding. Gregor's master was ready, drawing 2 blades from scabbards on his back and spinning them in a lithe show of dexterity that belied the desiccated nature of the corpse. "It's already dead," Gregor said. "You can't kill it." He could hear the panic rising in his voice. The 3 warriors looked to one another. Gregor saw the understanding exchanged there. It was unanimous. They knew they were the only line of defense between the ship, the slaves, and this demon. By some code that was more honorable than anything Gregor had ever followed, they were united in the knowledge that they had to stand their ground. So he would too. The Revenant charged, his blades a flashing whirlwind. The 3 fighters were prepared. They met the swords strike for strike, moving to flank their enemy. But Gregor's master was quick and moved like smoke in the wind to avoid their onslaughts. The narrowness of the dock kept them in tight exchanges, where their swords beat out staccato rhythms, light from the flames glowing on their blades and glistening on the sweat of their skin. The Revenant jerked to a stop, Chloe and Val having locked both his blades with their own. Twenge moved in for a final blow, but Gregor's master surprised them all with a backward somersault that freed his blades, which he brought hammering down on Val and Chloe. Val countered with his own strike, while Chloe dodged, weaving in close. The Revenant parried her next strike, then Val's. The blue stone pulsed, and Gregor sensed a spell released. Val charged in further, the Revenant backing up, so that the 2 of them engaged alone. "Chloe, Vic, some help here," he cried out over his shoulder. "I can't move," Chloe said, straining at her legs. Twenge, too, was grimacing as he tried to wrench his feet free of the dock. Gregor rambled out a counter spell to unbind their legs, and they both stumbled forward before falling into stride and re-engaging. His master did not hold back his enchantments. The stone grew brighter once more, and all 3 fighters were thrown backwards as if struck with an invisible battering ram. Chloe went over the side of the dock, but before she hit the water, Gregor cradled her in his power, imagining a protective net enshrouding her, and levitated her back onto the dock. Val had fallen on the ground, the Revenant lifting his swords to strike him while he recovered. Gregor seized Val less gently, sliding him out of danger. Twenge was charging now, but Gregor's master was not about to spare his former pupil from the fight. His gaze fell on Gregor, who, with his powers already extended, had left himself vulnerable to attack. His master took the opportunity, and Gregor felt a surge of focused power that made Felix's attacks from earlier feel like the haphazard enchantments of the most untrained novice. Gregor was slammed against the castle wall with force that knocked the breath from his body. It took all his effort not to lose consciousness as he struggled to pull air back into his lungs. Helping Val, Chloe, and Twenge was beyond him. He watched, desperate to regain his strength, while the 3 allies moved in on the Revenant once more. Without his interference, his master picked apart their attacks, combining blade and sorcery to wear all 3 of them down. Twenge was blasted against the castle next to Gregor, his sword clattering to the ground, falling next to him, his blonde locks across his face, his body eerily still, until he groaned and made an aborted attempt to roll onto his side. The Revenant drove into Chloe with a furious new attack. Fatigued, her counter-strikes were slow, her grace absent, and she fell back, giving ground, moving towards the burning planks of the dock. Gregor could feel the heat of the flames, so he knew she must have too. She pivoted to her left, but the revenant was too fast, his strength inexhaustible. His swing connected with her blade and knocked it free of her hand. Her sword tumbled out of reach and splashed into the harbor. The revenant made a second swing, but it stopped just short of her neck, her pulse visible, Val's blade holding back what would have been a fatal blow. "Not her. Not on my watch," he said. The revenant reconfigured his attack to engage Val, his two swords smashing into Val's one. Chloe drew a long knife from each boot, but as she closed in from the side, the revenant struck her with the same outpouring of power he had Gregor and Twenge. She went flying, as if drawn on a string, the blades spinning from her hands as she struck a pylon, arching her back in a painful twist. Twenge was getting back to his feet, shaking the cobwebs out of his head. He crossed the quay and fell in line alongside Val. For a few brilliant moments, the two of them moved in cadence and drove the revenant towards the edge of the dock where the water reflected the burning hellscape like a black mirror. But the rhythm of the battle was in Gregor now, and he knew his master would counter with an incantation. There was no time to wait. Gregor's thoughts were hazy and his steps off balance, but he forced himself up and wrapped Val in a protective shield just before the revenant called forth the flames from the burning dock to envelop him. Gregor sent a gust of wind, already wet with the rain that had finally broken, and extinguished the fire. But if the revenant had let his guard down, it had only been a feint, for as Twenge moved in, the revenant was ready and caught him square in the torso with his sword. Val reached out, but was blocked still by the same invisible spell wall that had just saved him. Twenge shook with the pain of the mortal blow, his own sword raised over his head, poised, ready in a now pointless strike. He and the revenant regarded one another, killer and victim, victor and vanquished, the raindrops beginning to fly between them in slanting lines. But Victor had not given up the fight just yet. He swept down his sword, like a woodsman splitting a log, and connected with the revenant's shoulder. Broken bits of ringmail glittered in an outward explosion. There was no blood. The flesh was dry and dead. A cloud of dust hung in the air as the arm dropped to the deck, and the sword slid off into the water. Gregor saw the snarl on the dead man's face and felt his master's displeasure as he willed the revenant to twist the blade in Twenge's gut. Twenge cried out and clutched the revenant's remaining hand, as if he too would drive the sword into himself. For a moment, he even seemed to pull himself closer to his executioner, sliding forward on the very blade that had murdered him, when he cried out, "No, NATALIE!" Val, the shields around him dissipated, smashed his sword down onto the revenant's skull. Blue light poured from the crack in the bone. Val squared his shoulders and swung once more, sending the head spinning from the shoulders like a broken melon. It bounced on the planks, the light escaping in beams before fading, the collar with the stone rolling free of the collapsed body. Val was immediately next to Twenge where he had fallen. Gregor froze with indecision before running to Chloe. She stirred and woke when he roused her, and, with Gregor's help, she crossed to where Twenge was laying. Victor's blonde beard and mustache were flecked with bright red blood, and he was rolled on his side since the blade protruding from his back made it impossible to lie flat. Gregor could already see the life draining out of his eyes. "Easy, friend. The fight is won," Val was saying. "Never expected to be on the same side," Twenge said. "I'd say you've redeemed yourself." Gregor could not tell if it was a grimace of pain or an ironic smile that flashed across Twenge's face before he died. Perhaps it was both. Chloe closed his eyes and Val touched his forehead to Twenge's before lifting him up and carrying him to the ship. Gregor and Chloe followed, Chloe bearing Twenge's longsword in her arms. As Gregor moved towards the ship, his eyes fell on the discarded moonstone, still in its brace that had held it around the revenant's neck. On impulse, he bent down, picked it up, and slipped it into his pocket. The slaves and sailors drew up the gangplank, all of them impervious to the rain that was now pouring down. The winds were a tumult, and Gregor was sure he would be required to cast some spell of weatherworking, which he did not know well, in order to guide them smoothly out of the harbor. But there was no need. The gusts died around the ship before coalescing into a steady breeze, blowing stern to bow, that filled the sails and pushed the ship away from the dock. The sailors cheered, and the slaves did as well, adding in a few curses at the shrinking island and the burning castle. Gregor noticed a figure behind the wheel. It was the same man who had been Twenge's first mate at the banquet, now revealed to be a weather worker of considerable skill. Chloe came alongside him, and they locked in an embrace that showed no sign of coming to an end. Gregor decided not to disturb them in their moment. He watched, feeling slightly lost, as the slaves regarded him with suspicious glances, while Haille and Val tended to Twenge's body. Alone, he made his way to the stern where he watched as rain and darkness obscured the smoking ruin of Dalhstrom. He was glad for the rain, for it hid the tears on his face. But if they were for the past he knew or the future he didn't, he was not sure. After some time alone, he was startled when a figure came alongside him. It was the weather worker whom Chloe had embraced. "Those were some spells you worked back on the quay," he said. "Thank you." "No, thank you. It is my wife Chloe you helped. I am in your debt. And I suppose I am in yours, for you have helped set me free too." The weather worker smiled. He did indeed have a kind face, much too kind of a face for a slave trader after all. "I am Gunther." "I'm Gregor stopped in the middle of his thought, turned to the smudge of rock and smoke on the horizon. Sheets of rain were closing it off from view like a curtain. "You can call me Nathan." Chapter 16. Rivertown. Adamantus scattered the piles of burning brush aside and cut the ropes binding Katlyn and Tallia. Relieved and abashed, Katlyn wrapped her arms around the elk's neck, while Gail chased the last of the NATALIE away, the bodies of those who had chosen to fight stretched out upon the forest floor. Gail wiped the blood from her blade using a dead man's scarf, then slammed the sword back into her sheath. "I don't even know if I have the words," she said, glaring at Katlyn through the branches of Adamantus' antlers. "Gail, Adamantus, I'm sorry. It is just, I felt we couldn't wait. I was tired of waiting. I was impatient." "You were overconfident," the elk said. "You were fools," Gail said, kicking a smoking branch aside and yanking one of her arrows out of the dead chief's back. "Had we been moments later, you'd be dead." The irony that Gail, who had essentially killed her once, was now so concerned about her well-being was not lost on Katlyn. Humbled, she dropped to her knees. "I'm so sorry. To you both." Gail let out a loud snort, and then blew the bangs off her forehead and rifled through the supplies the NATALIE left behind. She upended satchels and rucksacks, throwing them once empty into the bushes. When she was out of earshot, Adamantus turned to Katlyn. "She will calm down. In time." "She's a long way from wanting to enslave or kill me," Katlyn reflected. "The font may have powers we don't even understand," Adamantus said, swinging his head around to Tallia to inspect her head to foot. Seeing that no injury seemed to hinder her as she stripped the dead bodies of weapons, rings, and other valuables, he turned back to Katlyn. "You were going north." "To Antis. Adamantus, the Vorgs have left the forest. I need to know what happened to my family, she said, tears filming her eyes.
Indeed, we need to help, but it is safer if we travel together. For now, gather what you can.
Katlyn was a model of obedience, well aware that she had indiscretions to make up for, if not with the elk, certainly with Gail. She helped scavenge what they could from the dead before she mounted her horse and began a long, silent ride. She followed Gail and Adamantus without question or complaint as they pressed north into the evening, long after the violet sky had turned indigo and the stars came out over the mountains in the east. Gail finally stopped when the moon had risen, wrapped herself in furs taken from the candelie, and said nothing before falling into a deep sleep. Katlyn set to making a fire with Tallia. When she had brewed some pine needle tea, she turned to Adamantus. Should I wake Gail for some tea and supper?
Let her rest. She has not slept in days.
Katlyn swallowed a guilty lump in her throat and sat down with a warm cup in her hands. She struggled to find words. Did you find what you were looking for in the south?
No, Adamantus said. It was a false account as far as we could tell. I'm afraid the trail has grown cold. Best we put our efforts into helping the Antons against the Vorgs.
Katlyn has told me about the creatures. Are you sure the ones in Antis are the same as the ones you encountered in the forest? Tallia asked, while she sliced a potato and dropped the chunks into a pot of boiling water.
I can envision none other.
Tallia shivered despite the warmth of the cooking fire throwing up sparks next to her. They partook of the soup, leaving a bowl close to the fire in case Gail woke up hungry, then followed her example, wrapping themselves in blankets and furs and drifting off to sleep. They woke to the sound of a crow, Soot. The bird alighted on the ground next to Gail's head, which was still enclosed in a hood of blankets, and let out another loud caw. Gail peeked out from her cocoon, bleary-eyed, picked up a rock, and threw it at her faithful pet, along with a mumbled curse. The crow, unperturbed, snapped his wings and fluttered up to a branch overhead. He was joined promptly by Sapphire, who floated down to land in Adamantus' crown.
What tidings, little one?
The elk said, offering a warmer greeting than Gail. The answer came in the form of a horseman, whose mount came pounding up the trail to their camp. At this sound, Gail did rouse herself, picking up her bow and knocking back an arrow so that when the rider rounded the wall of trees and bushes they had nestled their camp behind, he found an arrow already aimed at his neck.
Well met,
Darryd said. My lord. Gail eased back the bowstring. Darryd drew up on the reins of his horse Barnaby as he entered the clearing, ducking beneath the low-hanging moss. When he lifted his eyes and saw Adamantus, he reached for his sword. Gail moved to intervene. My lord, this creature is our ally. He is not one of the dark elks we seek. Darryd studied the elk with a skeptic's eye.
This is the beast the prince rode into battle.
I am, Adamantus said. Darryd's hand went back to the hilt of his sword.
What sorcery is this?
He speaks, Katlyn interjected, and he is wise, so it is well that you listen, sir. Darryd relaxed his hand from his hilt, reached for the pommel of his saddle instead, and slid out of the stirrups to the ground.
My eyes have seen wonders, and my ears heard them as well.
He clasped forearms with his squire, a quick and succinct meeting of the flesh between two soldiers, bowed to the others, then asked their leave to sit next to the smoldering fire.
I've journeyed far to find you.
Was our path so easy to find? Gail asked, settling down across from him and offering him a water skin. Katlyn gathered more kindling, and Tallia stoked the embers.
For me, no, but these birds brought me to you directly. Had I been left to my own devices, I would have searched for you farther east, in Morvant lands." "We were there," Adamantus said. He offered a summary of their encounter with the Revenant and their fruitless search for the Rachne. Katlyn was grateful that the elk glossed over her own foolish decision to strike out on her own. The elk instead simply offered the explanation that they felt they were needed most urgently back in Antis. "Were you able to take the moonstone from Owion?" "Yes," Darrett said, his expression grave. He reached into his hip bag and removed an object wrapped in cloth and twine. He unfolded the cloth to reveal the bright blue of the moonstone, still set in the necklace that Owion had worn. "The Queen helped me, removing it from him while he slept. He flew into a rage when he found it gone, but almost as quickly he fell ill, growing sick and beset with shaking, not unlike a drunk without his drink. But after a few days he returned to himself, as if waking from a dream. His memories of his time wearing the stone are thin and partial." "The stones are dangerous. We have the other that was used to control Kyruna, the chief of the Morvant. Our true enemy, the Magus, seems to wield his power over others through them," Gail said. "Do we know the identity of this Magus?" "Sadly, not yet. But it is not presumptuous to see his hand working behind the Vorgs as well," Adamantus said. "We heard rumors from the north of the creatures. The armies of Telemar are eager to return to their home to help, but it is winter, and armies are slow to move. King Owion wants himself again, sent me on the mission that was twofold, to find you and journey to Antis to gather what reconnaissance I could, to bring back to the army. Owion plans to march north come spring. Antis came to our aid in our hour of need. Kerith will repay the debt. We are sister kingdoms, after all, within the realm of Anthor." "Spring may be too late," Adamantus said, his voice somber. "Then it is good we have the birds. We can send messages to Kerith that the armies are to leave now," Gail said. "Let us gather information first," Adamantus said. "From Rivertown at least. That way we can send them back with some tidings of the north." Katlyn's spirits were buoyed in the coming days. The addition of another warrior to their numbers made her feel safer. The news that Owion had returned to himself and that Kerith would come to their aid was welcome indeed. And the simple fact that each day they made progress towards her home with the intent to help alleviated some of her guilt and her anxiety for her family. They pushed hard into the north, the mountains constant sentinels to their east, the grasslands giving way slowly to the southernmost moors of Thestos. Gail and Darrett knew the land well, having marched through with the army only months before. Though Katlyn's outlook had grown rosy in past days, her hopes were dashed when they finally came to Rivertown. A cloud of haze hovered over the town, fed by strings of smoke, rising not only from chimneys, but from open fires burning on the outskirts and from clusters of families camping in the streets. A palisade of pointed logs surrounded the city, sticking out from the riverbanks like misplaced teeth. The bridges leading across the Liam and the Lynn to the strip of land that held the city were blockaded with any able-bodied men to be found, mostly graybeards and older boys, too old or too young to have gone south with the army to fight the season before. Their weapons were antiques, family heirlooms, or makeshift. One boy held a dagger tied to the end of a rake candle, another a modified scythe. The boys remained behind water barrels stacked on the roadway, while an older man, who listed under the weight of his own wood axe on his shoulder, stepped forward to bar their way onto the bridge. He said nothing, although he chewed his lips as if searching for the right words of greeting for such a strange lot as they. Katlyn realized that both parties waited for the other to speak. It was Darrett who dismounted and offered his hand to the old man. "Dark days they are, when the bridge to Rivertown is barricaded," "Dark indeed," the man said, his voice a high whisper. "Dark indeed, but you are welcome. These barricades are for things not human." "So, what we hear is true," Jared said, "of creatures from Sidon." The old man shook his head and sucked his teeth. "I will not speak of them, even in the light of day, lest I summon them. You will hear your fill from those who have fled their homes for the safety of the towns." He stepped aside and let them cross onto the bridge. They walked their horses. To ride would have been impossible anyway. The gutters were full. The reek of people, animals, smoke was eye-watering. It was Kareth all over again, but this time it was worse to Katlyn, for it was the kingdom of her home. Men, women, children, they all wore the same blank expressions of hopelessness and terror. Life had spilled out into every open space. Cooking fires burned in intersections and alleyways. Laundry hung from house galleries. Goats, pigs, chickens jostled against one another in makeshift pens. The line to the well was so long, it stretched around the corner. Voices were subdued. Children did not play. Rather, they gathered close to their mothers or in tight knots, their heads bent low, their gazes fleeting. Their party came to the town square and the chief's residence, but it was surrounded by more refugees and long lines. Some people waited for bread, others for audience with the chief, and others simply waited to be told where to go next. "We won't have much luck breaking through that queue," Jared said. "I imagine the constable has his hands full."
"I know a place we can go," Katlyn said. Drawing on her memories from their previous visit, Katlyn led them north, through streets equally crowded, to the edge of town, where River Ridge waited. The gates stood open, and the expanse of lawn was occupied by tents, wagons, and dozens of families. There was some relief here, at least, from the oppression and disorder outside. Children stopped their game of tag to gaze curiously at Adamantis. Women and men were busy with chores, seeing to laundry, cooking, or building impromptu tents and animal pens. Katlyn made her way up the main path towards the manor house, and before reaching it, spotted Lorna, her sleeves rolled above the elbow, her head wrapped in a shawl, her front covered with an apron. Lorna was too involved in stirring a cauldron of steaming laundry to notice them approach, but Sorrel, her ever-present apprentice, noticed them and tugged on her mentor's skirt. Lorna's eyes grew wide upon seeing them, and she threw open her arms. "Katlyn, by the stars, come here. These times call for embracing." Katlyn flung herself into the woman's chest, relieved to meet a face that had not changed, even if Rivertown had. "You bring companions? Only one that I know," Lorna said, nodding to the elk, then looking to Jared, Gail, and Tallia. Katlyn offered quick introductions, then said, "It seems too much to ask, my lady, in light of the generosity you already extended to these in your care, but we beseech you for at least temporary shelter, so that—"
"All are welcome," Lorna said with a smile. "Come inside. We have much news to exchange." The creatures came from Sidon, raiding villages and farmsteads alike. The legend said they feared the light of day, but to these monsters it seems to make no difference any longer, Lorna said. They were gathered around the hearth in the kitchen, one of the few rooms of the manor not given over to refugees, presumably so it could still function. Katlyn found the transformation of the formerly empty manor remarkable. Life had returned to its abandoned halls, and Lorna seemed energized by it, her eyes bright. She poured each of them tea, Sorrel following with a pitcher of cream and a pot of honey. "We encountered a horde of many dozen in Sidon," Adamantis said. "Ah, so you have revealed yourself in full Stygorn," Lorna said, not missing a beat at the sound of Adamantis' voice, even if Sorrel looked up startled, the pitcher and honey pot trembling in her hands. The elk lowered his head and blinked slowly in acknowledgement. The time for secrets has long passed among these friends, he said.
Quite, Lorna said, pulling up a stool and settling down on it, a bucket of green beans between her feet that she began to pick and snap. She was in constant motion, and with the numbers of refugees in her care, Katlyn could see why. She leaned in to help, eager to be of use and anxious to do something with her hands, and noticed that Tallia had already beaten her to it, wordlessly finding an understanding with Sorrel, the two of them working in quiet unison.
But the horde numbers in the hundreds now, not dozens,
Lorna continued.
I don't believe in coincidences. I'm too old for that. If this Magus is as powerful and has the influence you say he does, I see his hand behind this.
We are assuming that the Magus is behind the Morvaunt invasion and the invasion of the Vorgs, so he tries to sow chaos and discord throughout the realm. But to what end? Gail asked.
These are weapons wielded with intent. What looks like chaos to us may be a carefully concealed stratagem, Lorna said. I don't see the Magus endgame.
Darragh shook his head.
But this is a foe perhaps beyond us all. And yet in our midst.
Lorna's hands grew still and came to rest on her knees.
The king of Entis is dead. The Magus goes through pains to influence the machinations of kingdoms and tribes formerly at peace, while remaining in the shadows. Then the Magus works to remove Prince Haille as a participant in all this.
Does that mean Haille has some part to play in the Magus strategy? Gail asked, her fingers tightening around her cup.
An interesting presumption, but there is another, Lorna said, her eyes lifting and focused as if on a point far away on the horizon. Haille might know who the Magus is.